Hi guys, how are you? Thanks so much for coming down. So welcome to Procrastination for entrepreneurs and the self-employed. My name is Jayson Moore. I was giving it a couple of minutes. There's about 50 people signed up, so it's unusual. You would expect between 20 and 30 here, so there's still a few people streaming in. But I might just start with a little quick intro anyway, while we are waiting on a few more people. So I want to start today, with a story. And the reason I want to start with a story is I want to talk a little bit about our behavior and its connection to our emotions, what we feel, and meaning. So I'd like you to imagine something for me. And as I'm describing the situation I'm imagining, I want you to let me know in the chat box. I want you to let me know how you would feel in the situation. Okay? So I want you to imagine this. You're sitting at home, you're watching an episode of your favorite Netflix show, you're chilled on the couch of an evening, maybe you have a glass of wine, and then suddenly you hear a really loud knock. You're not expecting anyone. Let me know in the chat box, how might you feel? Sitting at home, nice and chilled, not expecting anyone, suddenly you hear a really loud knock on your door. How might you feel? Curious, cheers Mary, thanks very much. Surprised? Thanks Laurel. Anyone else surprised? Okay. Very good, okay. So up you get and you swing open the door, and lo and behold, standing right in front of you is the most beautiful specimen of human being you've ever seen. That can be a man, it can be a woman, whatever your sexual preference, but a very beautiful person is standing there at your door. Let me know in the chat box, how might you feel now? So very, very beautiful person has just walked into your life. Beautiful smile, beautiful eyes. Mary, even more curious. Okay, quite positive. Donal is even more surprised, or surprised again. Gillian is also surprised. Awesome. Anyone else? Okay. So this very beautiful person just walked into your life. You're a bit taken aback. So you take a bit of a step back to give them, I suppose, more of a better look up and down. And suddenly you realize, actually, this very beautiful person is in fact wearing a Gardaí uniform. And you weren't expecting a guard at your door. Maybe there's something wrong. Maybe you've done something wrong. Let me know in the chat box, how might you feel now? So you're not expecting anyone at your door and there's a guard there. Worried, okay? Unsettled. Here's Mary. You think you would have noticed the uniform first. Fair enough. Gillian, I'm just wondering how you'd feel though. Okay, so we've gone from surprised to unsettled and worried. Okay, so you kind of take another step back and suddenly you realize, actually, the guard's uniform, it's a little bit off. And suddenly you've noticed they started unbuttoning their shirt. In fact, so you suddenly realize that someone played a joke on you. In fact, it's not a real guard at all. In fact, someone has called a stripper, and it's actually a stripper standing at your door and they start gyrating. How might you feel now? So you've gone from being surprised to slightly worried. How might you feel now? Confused? Gillian's very happy. Confused as well. Mary's thinking happy days. Okay. So I suppose a range of emotions, or an emotional roller coaster there in a couple of minutes. And I suppose the point of this story is I wanted to get across that how we feel in a situation is very much dependent on the meaning that we attach to it. So the person standing at your door didn't actually change in this instance at all. All that actually changed was what you focused on, and as a result, your perception of the situation, i.e. the meaning that you attach to the situation. So how does this link to procrastination? Well, generally, we tend to increase a behavior if we feel rewarded in a situation. We tend to decrease behavior if we feel punished by it. And how do we decide what's a reward and what's a punishment? Well, that's all got to do with the meaning that we attach to the situation. So when you opened the door and there was a very beautiful person standing in front of you, most people, I suppose, associated with a reward of some description, people felt curious, and I suppose it's quite a positive emotion. When we realized it's a guard, then I suppose we're associating that with more with punishment and there might be something wrong. And the third instance, well, that's very kind of down to personal preference, obviously. But I suppose my point is that the meaning that we attach to a situation is going to change dependent on what we focus on and the meaning that we have. So today we're going to have a look at what we focus on, and the meaning that we attach to what we focus on tends to affect our tendency to procrastinate. Okay, so just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. Although I'll be doing most of the talking today, I am going to be putting you guys to work. So if you have a pen and a piece of paper to hand, it will be very, very handy. Also, if you're not watching on your mobile phone, if you have a mobile phone handy as well, I'll be doing a poll later, and the camera on your mobile phone will be very handy for it. I will do a bit of a Q&A at the end to talk about this or anything else that I do if anyone's interested. But if you have any questions, the best thing to do is to stick them into the chat box. I have a separate screen set up for it. Also, if I'm going too fast or if I'm going too slow, please let me know. Or if you need me to explain something again, just let me know in the chat box and I'll try and keep an eye on it. Finally, we are recording today. So I will send a video out to people afterwards as well, just in case there's issues with internet connection and stuff. Okay, so I suppose before we begin proper, I should introduce myself. My name is Jayson and I am a psychologist whose background is in the psychology of performance and productivity, of personal and professional development, and happiness and well-being. Really, what I'm all about is helping people move forward. I help them deal with challenging situations and get the results that they want. And I do that by helping them to increase their effectiveness. Now, I tend to help people increase their effectiveness by focusing on kind of three key areas. The first of those is their happiness and their well-being and stress. And the reason I focus on happiness and well-being so much and stress as well is that we tend to be much more productive, we tend to be much more effective, we tend to be much more confident when we're happier. So we might look at things like what makes you happy, and where are you in relation to that? So what makes you happy in your business? What makes you happy in your life? What makes you happy in your relationships or in your career? And, how can we get you there? The second area then that I tend to look at is all about gaining clarity and getting organized. So in order to move forward, really often what we have to do, really have to know where it is that we're going. So this is often about your goals. Are your goals in line with what makes you happy? Are your goals in line with the kind of person you are? Are your goals in line with what's really important to you? I suppose the practical application of this is I'll help people make the big decisions and often put a plan in place in order to get where they need to go. The third area then that I tend to help people with is all about overcoming barriers, because sometimes in order to move forward, we need to overcome particular challenges. So the barriers I tend to help with are more psychological in nature and related to the performance and productivity. So I suppose common issues I help people with are things like confidence, motivation, anger, behavior change, and of course the topic of today's talk, which is procrastination. So really what I'm all about is helping people get unstuck, unstressed, and clear. So today we are going to talk about procrastination. I suppose the idea with today is it's to just give you a feeling a little bit for the kind of stuff I do, what it might be like to work with me with a topic that's relatively light, but something that a lot of us do. So today we're going to have a look at the what, the how, and the why of procrastination, and we're also going to look at some tools, tips, and techniques to get you started with a little bit less psychological pain and get you started a little bit quicker on those things you need to do. So we'll start off by looking at the what. So the slightly boring textbook definition is that procrastination is putting off until later what our better judgment tells us we should do now. So it's hard really what procrastination is about. It's about avoidance. It's actually about avoiding discomfort, or more accurately, it's about avoiding immediate discomfort. And often we avoid this immediate discomfort by doing things that can suddenly seem much more important or suddenly can seem much more pleasurable. So for example, when I procrastinate, I tend to do things like clean, or I've also been known to watch like a series of a Netflix show that I've already watched in order to avoid doing what I should be doing. And this is kind of an interesting point about procrastination. It's a little bit different than laziness. Because when we're lazy, we tend to want to do nothing at all, or at the very least, we want to do less of whatever we're doing. But when we procrastinate, we can sometimes go to great lengths. We can spend an awful lot of energy in order to avoid doing the thing that we're trying to avoid doing. So why care enough about it to put together an hour on it? Well, this material came from when I was working on my master's thesis a couple of years ago. And what was happening to me was I was waking up in the morning and I was procrastinating most of the morning and often into the afternoon. And around 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, out of guilt, I would start working on my master's thesis. And because I started so late, what I would end up doing is I would end up working late out of guilt as well. And so it could be 10 or 11 o'clock at night before I finished work. And I suppose the major impact this had is I didn't have a lot of time to spend with my friends. I didn't have a lot of time to spend with my partner at the time. I didn't have a lot of time to socialize. And this is, I suppose, the first thing about procrastination, not just that it makes us less productive, it means that we get to do less of the things we want to do because there's certain things that we need to do. And, eventually we will get those things done, but it's often at the cost and the time of the things that we really, really want to be doing and spending our lives at. The second reason I think procrastination is important, is a little bit more subtle, is because we get less enjoyment from what I call the tools of procrastination. So the tools of procrastination are just those things that we use in order to procrastinate. And I'm going to tell you another little story, and I want you to imagine it for me as well, just to kind of explain what I mean by this. So what I want you to imagine is, again, you're sitting at home on your couch and you're watching an episode of your favorite Netflix show. Now you're watching that episode of your favorite Netflix show in order to, it's a reward for having done something you've put off for ages. So I'll give you an example. I used to have like a really disgusting spare bathroom in a house I used to live in when I was a student. And it's something that we used to always put off cleaning, no matter how gross it got. So I want you to imagine there's something that you're procrastinating, or that's something you've been procrastinating about. And you've done it, and now you're rewarding yourself with this episode of the Netflix show. Let me know in the chat box, how do you think you'd feel? I'm very sorry. I just have a couple of messages in the chat there that's saying there's no sound. Could other people maybe just let me know? I just need to make sure that you can hear me.
Yep.
Awesome, cool. Thanks very, very much. I think it's just that person. Sorry, whoever it is. P. Leslie, I'm very sorry. I'll send you a recording if you can't hear. Okay, so sorry, what I was asking you to do was to imagine how you would feel. You've something you've been putting off for ages. You've finally done it, and to reward yourself, you're watching a favorite or an episode of your whatever Netflix show you're watching. I'm watching an episode of the Ozarks right now. It's great. Elated, relaxed, positive, honest. Okay, all very positive. Okay, so now what I want you to do is I want you to imagine that you're watching that exact same episode of that exact same show, except this time you're watching it in order to avoid doing something that you've been putting off for ages. How might you feel now? So this exact same show, but this time you're watching it in order to avoid doing it. Guilty, yeah, distracted, exactly. And this is one of the things with procrastination, even when we're doing stuff like away from work, but if we've been procrastinating badly and we know in ourselves we should be doing more, it hangs over us and it sits there. And I think that's a terrible thing around it. Okay. So what do we tend to procrastinate about? We tend to procrastinate in kind of three main areas, or three different types of tasks. The first of these are down to, I suppose, what I call self-maintenance. So self-maintenance can refer, I suppose, to our physical maintenance. So maybe it's about starting that workout. Maybe it's about finally, taking care of our diet. But self-maintenance can also be psychological as well. So maybe it's finally taking the steps to go see that counselor, or finally starting that meditation course or something like that. So the first area that we tend to procrastinate on is all around our self-maintenance. Second area we tend to procrastinate about is more about self-development. So the reason I have a picture of our guitar there is that there's a guitar sitting in my living room for about 2.5 years. It's literally got a layer of dust on it. And I've been procrastinating about that, I suppose, part of my self-development for years. Self-development can also refer to your professional development as well. So maybe you're putting off that master's, or learning that new skill, or doing that new course. The third area then that we tend to procrastinate on are tasks given to us from external sources. So the reason I have a picture of our boss baby here is one of the most common ones of these is from work or from a boss of some description. But other external sources, maybe you're avoiding doing something that your spouse wants you to do, or maybe you're avoiding doing something that like a government agency wants you to do. I know I get my tax returns in pretty much on the last day or two as well. Okay, so the reason I suppose I'm talking about those is what I want you to do now is put your finger on something that you're currently procrastinating about, and we're going to work on that for the rest of the workshop. So what I want you to do is I want you to take out that pen and a piece of paper, and I want you to draw a triangle for me. So to look a little something like that. Don't worry too much about the graphics. And in the middle of that triangle, I want you to write down one thing that you're procrastinating about currently that you'd like to work on for the rest of the workshop. If you'd like, stick it into the chat box, but no pressure as well. I suppose I'm kind of conscious it's a little bit of a private topic, whatever it may be, but I'll be interested. But maybe let me know in the chat box if everyone has got something, because we're going to work on this for the rest of the workshop. So just let me know when you've taught us something in the chat box. Bernard, college assignments. Yeah, well, this is college stuff can be funny because I suppose often there's no immediate pressure with it, and it's coming up to deadline days and stuff. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Posting cluttered collectibles on eBay. Excellent, Richard. Wow. Making calls to prospects. I think sales is a big one. And we'll get to some of the psychology one might be going on there as well. Derek have done okay, awesome. And completing research by sailing, excellence. Thanks, Mary. Yes, I do. It is great to know I procrastinate too. I mean, I teach this stuff, but I think it's a part of human nature. It's about doing it as little as possible. And Gillian, hiring a new team member, excellent. So everyone's got something cool. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is the how of procrastination. What I mean by the how, what I'm talking about is the strategies that we tend to use. So as I'm going through these, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to imagine the last time you procrastinated about whatever you're working on. And I want you to try and put your finger on the behavior that you use to procrastinate. I'll explain why in a little while. So I'm going to go through some examples of things that we often do, just to kind of see if I can trigger your memories a little bit for you. So one strategy we often use when we procrastinate is we overthink. That's where, we can't decide whether to do A or B, and so we end up not doing either. Another thing we often do is find excuses. So we tell ourselves that I don't have the time, or I don't have the energy, or I don't have the resources of some description, when in fact it's usually down to our resourcefulness as opposed to our resources. When unimportant tasks suddenly become important, this is a personal favorite of mine. I have been known to spend a half day cleaning out a wardrobe that was sitting in dereliction in my house rather than work on my master's thesis. Another thing we often do is we tell ourselves, I'll do it when the stars align. I'll do it when everything's perfect. I suppose the issue with this is conditions are very rarely perfect in order to start anything. Another common thing we tell ourselves is, I'll do it tomorrow. But it's a terrible Garth Brooks song to put so succinctly, tomorrow often never comes. Another thing we often do is we label ourselves. We tell ourselves that we're slow, or we're lazy, or we're stupid. And really, we think it's down to our ability in some way, but usually with procrastination, it's much more down to our motivation or lack of motivation rather than it being an ability question. Leaving things until the last minute. This is also known as the lastminute.com. I'll talk a bit more about this in a while, but I suppose often what this is we leave things until the last minute, don't give ourselves enough time to do it properly, and so don't get things finished. Another personal favorite of mine, creating the illusion of starting. So I have been known to get up in the morning, come into my office to start work and notice things are a little bit off or things are a little bit untidy, and I'll start tidying up and then spend 45 minutes rearranging my whole desk and office. After all that effort, I go, God, I need a coffee. And then it's been an hour later and I haven't actually started any work. Another one we often do is give ourselves a reward before the task. This is like, I suppose, the little treat in order to ease the pain a little bit. This is the cookie before the gym. I suppose the issue with rewarding ourselves before the task is, there's nothing there really to motivate us to do the task afterwards. Waiting to feel motivated is another strategy, a very, very common one. This is something people approach me about a lot. And I suppose the issue with this is the point where we feel least motivated is just before we start to do something. And the reason for that is that the pain we associate with the task, that's when that pain is closest, and so that we're kind of much more aware of it. Funnily enough, the point where we feel most motivated to do something is just after we start. And that's because we started to make some progress. And making progress towards something that's important to you, or any goal, in fact, is the main source of positive emotion that we have in our lives. And I'll go into that in more depth again in a while. Finally, social media, the great distraction, And I think a lot of the time when we're procrastinating by social media, really what we're doing is we're distracting ourselves to kind of soothe ourselves. Okay, so hopefully you're able to put your finger on the last time that you procrastinated or the behavior you generally use. So what I'd like you to do is to take out your triangle, and I want you to write in the bottom right-hand corner, I want you to write the word behavior, and I want you to write what behavior that you generally do, or that the last time that you procrastinated, what behavior did you use in order to procrastinate? What did you do instead of doing what you were supposed to do? Just let me know in the chat box if that makes sense to me, and if you could let me know what your procrastination behavior is. I'd be very interested. Always find these very interesting. So I'll give you a moment and just let me know in the chat box once you've managed to do it, and we'll start skipping on as well. Many interesting behaviors. Avoidance, I'll do it tomorrow. Daydreaming. Preparation and research, yeah, I get that. It's so much preparation, and then we don't actually start. I feel you, Richard. Okay. Overthinking, and I'll do it tomorrow. Yeah, very, very common, Gillian. Paralysis by analysis, I think is another word for that. Always something more urgent to be done. Yeah, that's, are we working on the urgent or the importance? Absolutely. So fear of failure. So Gary, I'll get to kind of emotions and the thinking in a minute, but I want to try putting your finger on here is what's the behavior? What are you actually doing instead of the task you should be doing, either generally, or what would be better is if you can actually think back to the last time that you procrastinated. So what I'm trying to do here really is just to start to create some awareness around the patterns around your procrastination, because like, I suppose awareness is the first kind of step to change. We need to click what's going on, because it just means the next time you catch yourself doing it, you're much less likely to do it. Okay, distracted, checking email or LinkedIn. Yeah, I get you, Donald. Very easy to get sucked in. Don't know where to start. Inaction, overthinking. Excellent, Eva. Thanks very, very much. Okay. So next thing we're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about the why procrastination. Why on earth do we do it? So to talk about the why, I'm going to use a model, a very famous model from psychology called the cognitive behavioral model. So don't be put off by the large sounding psychobabbly words, but the cognitive behavioral model, cognitive just stands for your thinking, behavioral just stands for what you do, your actions. So you can think of it as the thinking and behaving model. The cognitive behavioral model puts forward this, that around any given situation, we've got three possible responses. We have emotions, we feel things. We have behaviors, we do things. We have thoughts or beliefs, we think things. And it gets really interesting when we realize that these three possible responses we have to a situation actually interact with each other in really interesting ways. So, for example, our emotions can affect how we think and how we behave. So I think a good example of this is if you've ever been really, really angry with someone, and maybe you thought some very terrible things about that person, and maybe you even said some very terrible things to that person or about that person. And then it's an hour or 2 hours later and the anger has subsided and you're sitting there thinking to yourself, oh my God, I can't believe I thought that, or I can't believe I said that. And so how we feel can really affect how we think and how we behave. Another important relationship in this triangle is that our behaviors, the things that we do, can really affect how we feel and how we think. I think a good example of this from my own life is I used to have a huge fear of public speaking. And a couple of years ago, the first time I ever spoke in public, I remember about halfway through the talk that I suddenly caught myself saying to myself, hey, you're doing this. This is going okay. This is great. And I started to feel the emotion of pride. And so my point with that is the things we do, our behaviors, can affect how we feel and how we think. Now, a very important relationship in the cognitive behavioral model is that these thoughts, or is that our thoughts or beliefs, the top of the triangle, affect the other two corners, our emotions and our behaviors. In fact, it's so important you can almost think of our emotions and our behaviors as a consequence of our thoughts or our beliefs. So I'll give you an example again from my own past. So when I was working on my master's thesis all those years ago, I was having thoughts, things like, I don't want to do this. This is too hard. It shouldn't be this hard. And as a result, I was feeling emotions like dread or frustration or boredom, and I was procrastinating rather horrifically. Now, the thing is, though, if we change our thoughts or beliefs, we can actually change our emotions and our behavior. So as the deadline got a bit closer, and I did a bit of work on myself as well, I started having very different thoughts about my master's thesis. Things like, oh, this is important, and oh, what strategy can I use? And what are the priorities? What do I need to do to get this over the line? And these different thoughts led to very different emotional and behavioral reactions. I started to feel very, very focused and determined. And also I sat my arse down and started to do some work. So by changing our thoughts, we can change how we feel and how we behave. So often what we think often we think that we're in a situation or there's a trigger or something sets us off. For example, me having a big nasty master's thesis to do. And this is the reason that we feel particular things and we do particular behaviors. But actually, the cognitive behavioral model is saying it's a little bit more complicated. It's that we got this situation that we're in, we have a trigger, and we have thoughts or beliefs, or we attach a meaning to that situation. And it's these two combined that lead to our emotional and our behavioral reactions, i.e., in this case, me feeling dread and frustration and boredom and procrastinating badly. So it gets a little bit more interesting again when we realize that we've got different types of thought or different levels of thought or belief. So I'm just going to talk about two different levels today. And the first is what's called an automatic thought. So an automatic thought, I suppose you can think of your thoughts sometimes as like the layers of an onion. And so what the automatic thought is that surface outside layer. It's kind of just what's on top, I suppose. It's literally what's going through our mind at any given moment. It's like a stream of consciousness describing the situation, describing what's going on, describing ourselves, describing other people. Sometimes people say to me, what are you talking about? I don't have these automatic thoughts. I don't have this stream of consciousness describing the situation. What I tell them is the voice that's telling them that they don't have automatic thoughts, that they don't have a stream of consciousness describing the situation. That's the voice I'm talking about. That's what an automatic thought is. So, for example, when I was working through my master's thesis, one very common automatic thought I would have was, ugh, I don't want to do this. So if we take these automatic thoughts, we take what's going through our mind at any given moment, and we start to ask ourselves questions like, why? Or we start to go, because. We start to say things, or if we ask ourselves, why does that matter? We start to get at then is the next level or layer of thought. And that's what's called an underlying belief. So an underlying belief, as the name suggests, is literally the thought or belief that underlies our automatic thoughts. What they really are is they're a rule or an attitude or an assumption that tends to lead to our emotional and our behavioral reactions. So for example, when I was having the automatic thought, I don't want to do this, if I kind of finish the sentence with because, a good example of a rule might be, I don't want to do this because I might fail. And a good example of an attitude might have been something like, I don't want to do this because it's boring. And a good example of an assumption might be something like, oh, I don't want to do this because it must be perfect. And if it's not perfect, I've failed. So really what we're getting at here is the story that we're telling ourselves. That's really what an underlying belief is. It's the story or the narrative that we're telling ourselves in any given situation that tends to lead to our emotional and our behavioral reactions. So if you want to think of the cognitive behavioral model in terms of a triangle, then we have our emotions, behavior, and really at the top of the triangle is the story that we're telling ourselves in any given situation. So what I'm going to do we're going to try to put our finger on the emotion and the story next. Okay. So what is your procrastination story? Well, I normally do a lot of, when I'm working with people individually, we do a lot of digging in terms of trying to figure out what's the underlying belief or story or narrative we're telling ourselves. But luckily enough for procrastination, there seems to be kind of 6 very, very common stories that lead us to procrastinate. And I'm going to run through these now. And what I'd like you to do is, as I'm running through them, I want to see if you can put your finger on what your story is, what story you're telling yourself that's leading to your procrastination. So the 6 stories are related usually to kind of 3 specific emotions. So the first 3 stories are related to emotions like anxiety or dread or maybe even guilt. And these stories, I suppose, are all about stories we tell ourselves when we're beating ourselves up a little bit. So the first of these stories is what I call the worrier. And the worrier tends to procrastinate because they believe that if they try, then they might fail. So the worrier tends to fear things are going to go wrong. Often they think that things are going to go really badly wrong. Sometimes they think things are going to, be catastrophically bad. They tend to avoid risk or change because they've got a lack of confidence in their own ability. And so they don't start things because they don't think they're going to be able to do it, and they think it'll look bad. The second story often associated with procrastination is, unless it's perfect, I'm a failure. It's perfectionism. And the perfectionist tends to procrastinate or not start the thing they should be doing because I suppose they think that they're never going to be able to do it perfectly. And so if they don't start, well, then they can't fail. I suppose with this one, very, very common in terms of people working on projects or stuff like that as well. The third story we tend to tell ourselves when we procrastinate is, if I don't accomplish all of this, then I'm a failure. This is what I call the overdoer. So what the overdoer tends to do is they tend to take on too many things because they associate their self-worth with the amount of work that they do. So they take on too many things, they fail to prioritize, and as a result, they don't get the important things done. So the next three stories associated with procrastination are much more associated with different emotions, more so associated with emotions like boredom and frustration. So the first of these is, I perform better under pressure. Again, this is thelastminute.com. So suppose thelastminute.com, what they think is that usually a task is beneath them, or they find a task very, very boring. And they think they need the adrenaline of that kind of stress of leaving things to the last minute in order to feel motivated to do it. I suppose the issue with this is if you ever compare your performance to when you give yourself enough time and you compare it to when you're trying to do things at the last minute, invariably you perform better when you give yourself enough time. Story number 5 is, I shouldn't have to do it. And I always hear this in quite a childish, whingy voice when I say it out. I suppose I shouldn't have to do it is often the story we tell ourselves when we get a task from an external source. So whether it's, a boss or a spouse or, even a government agency or something like that. I suppose the issue with this story is usually we're telling ourselves this story, but actually we do have to do it, unfortunately. The final story associated with procrastination is, I shouldn't have to work hard to fulfill my dreams. This is what we call the dreamer to an extent. I suppose the issue with this one is, if you've ever spoken to anyone who's ever achieved anything of note, then they have had to work bloody hard in order to get there. Okay, so take a minute and see if you can put your finger on your story. And what I want you to do is to take out your sheet again. And I want you to write in the bottom left the word emotion, and in the top your story, and see if you can put your finger on which one of those 6 stories. So I'll put them up on the screen again in a second. So just to bring you through my own example, so I was procrastinating about starting strength training recently. And the behavior I would tend to do was tidying up. So the last time that I procrastinated about it, what I did is I walked into my little office, and I've got a chin-up bar, and that's usually what I use to tidy up, or it's what I use to work out. And then I noticed the room was a little bit messy, so I was like, I'll tidy up before I work out in case I trip over something. And then I ended up tidying up for about half an hour and didn't leave myself enough time to work up or to work out. The emotion is the next thing I want you to try to put your finger on. So are you feeling something like dread or anxiety when you think about doing the task? Are you feeling more boredom or apathy? Or are you feeling more kind of frustration or even anger about having to do the task? So stick that into the bottom left. In terms of me, what I was tended to feel when I thought about working out or strength training, is I tend to feel a little bit of dread and a little bit of worry. And so the next thing then I want you to put your finger on is the story. So the story that I was using to procrastinate was, if I try, then I'll fail. And I suppose what was happening was this for me, is that I've tried to do this so often in the past and it's never quite worked out. And usually what happens is I work out for a week or two, get quite sore because I've just started out doing it, and then something will happen and I'll get knocked out of my routine, and it'll be a few weeks will pass by, and then so I've never been able to consistently do it. So I suppose because I've failed so many times in the past, I'm telling myself if I try, then I'll fail. Okay, so see if you can put your finger on your story. I'll stick them up there again, and I'm going to do a little poll in a minute and see what's the most common story in this group. It might be interesting to see. So take your time with it, and I'll stick up this poll in a moment. So if you manage to put your finger on your story, so what I want you to do next is I want you to take out your phone, and I want you to open the camera on it, and I want you to point it at the screen, and you should get a little notification, and if you click on that, it should bring you to a online poll that's asking what is your procrastination story. And so stick it in there, and I'll put the results up in just a second. I'm just very curious to see with this group, people who generally tend to work for themselves, seems to be whether their stories are any different than some of the other groups I work with. Okay, there's a few people into it. I'm going to assume now that everyone's had time to kind of click and get the QR code working. If anyone's having trouble with that, let me know. Okay, just a little bit in the chat there while you guys are doing that. Okay, P. Leslie or who Masumoto is saying, overwhelmed, so much to do, nothing relates to you. Very interesting. Feel free. I mean, I'm more than happy. I'll have a conversation with you later to see if we can get to the bottom of your story. Okay, Gary, if it's not perfect, I'm a failure. I stuck it in there. Okay, that's very interesting. So I did this a week ago with a group of entrepreneurs and the self-employed. And it's funny, the two stories that never seem to come up with this group is I shouldn't have to work hard to achieve my dreams, or I shouldn't have to do this. Interesting that no one thinks that they perform better under pressure, but often, a fear of failure, or if I don't accomplish all of this, then I failed, or then overdoers seems to be very, very common in this group. Very interesting. Okay, we'll go back to the main presentation. Okay, so found that some way interesting. So we have the what, the how, and the why we're doing it. Now we're going to have a look at some tools, tips, and techniques in order that we might do it a little bit less. So I suppose the interesting thing about that triangle is because each corner affects the other two, you can, in terms of your strategies, you can focus your strategies on any one of the three corners. So the first strategy we're going to do is we're going to focus on that story in order to change how we feel and our behavior. But the second strategy then is going to focus on how we feel, our emotions, and the third strategy is going to focus on our behavior. Okay. So the first strategy is all about challenging your stories. We have these stories that we tell ourselves, but I suppose one of the issues with them is that sometimes the stories we tell ourselves aren't 100% true, and sometimes they're not 100% helpful. And even if I suppose the stories that we're telling ourselves aren't serving us to an extent, thing is, you can't, I suppose, in terms of what you can do about it, well, you can't just tell yourself what to think. It doesn't really work. So I'll give you an example of that. Sometimes people talk about affirmations and stuff, or you hear about people going into the bathroom and staring themselves in the mirror and saying, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. The issue with this is it doesn't usually work. And the reason being, well, the issue is we don't believe ourselves. So what can we do about it? Well, there is a method called Socratic Questioning, which is, if you give it a Google, actually, it'll bring up the full list of Socratic questions for you. But it's a method of testing the validity and the utility of a thought or belief or a story, i.e. how true or how useful it is. So I'm going to use the example of the story that I was telling myself around weight training or strength training in order to demonstrate this to you. But what I want you guys to do is I want you to take your story and I want you to ask yourselves the questions that I'll put up on the screen now. We'll try and work through them and see if we can kind of create a better story for yourself. So the first question I want you to ask yourself in relation to your story is your story 100% realistic? Now, I suppose if you're telling yourself that story, there's probably a little bit of truth in it, or there might be a little bit of truth in it. Maybe there's not. But is it 100% realistic? In fact, if you could rate from 0 to 100 how true it is, with 0 being complete fabrication and 100 being it's 100% objective truth, how realistic is it? So you can maybe to think about this, what a good way to think about it is to ask yourself, well, why do you think it's realistic? And maybe why not? Why do you think it's not realistic? And another way of thinking about that question is, what's the evidence for it? Or what's the evidence against it? So give yourself a second on that. And then what I want you to think about then is, even if the story is a little bit realistic or a certain amount realistic, what might be a more realistic version of that story? What might be a version of that story that's even more true? So I'll give you an example, or I'll use my own example to explain a little bit better what I mean by that. So my story was, if I try, then I'll fail. And when I asked myself, is that story 100% realistic? Is it 100% true? And what might be the evidence for it and against it? Well, I had to say, well, it was at least partly realistic, because I have failed in the past. I suppose I wasn't imagining that. But when I looked at the other side of the coin and went, well, why might it not be realistic? Well, I had to admit that I suppose conditions are a lot different for me now. I've got an awful lot more structure in my life. I'm quite a bit healthier overall. And so I suppose when I thought what might be a more realistic version of that story, it might have been something like, well, if I try, I might fail, but I might also succeed because things are a little bit different now. Okay. So is your story 100% realistic? And what might be a more realistic story? Okay, the next question I want you to think about in relation to your story is it a helpful story? Is it serving you? Maybe you'd have a little think about maybe why it's a helpful story or why it might not be a helpful story. Another way of thinking about this, I suppose, of whether a story is helpful is you can have a little think about, how's the story making you feel? And what's the story making you do behavior-wise? I suppose we have our triangle for that. So is it a helpful story? Once you've asked yourself that, get yourself a yes or a no, ask yourself, what might be a more helpful version of that story? What might be a version of that story that might actually help you with your goals, might help you do the things that you need to do? So again, I'll go back to my example. So that story I was telling myself, if I try, then I'll fail. Was it a helpful story? Absolutely not. It was causing me to procrastinate, and it was causing me to feel kind of dread around working out, and I suppose a fear of failure. So when I asked myself what might be a more helpful story, well, this is one I robbed from a lady called Carol Dweck, who wrote a very good book called Mindset. Highly recommend checking it out. And in that book, she talks about, I suppose, when we try something and we don't succeed. And she's got a very good mantra. She's like, we either succeed or we learn. So a more helpful story I might have been able to tell myself is this, was that, well, okay, I can try again. And if it doesn't work out, well, then I can try and learn from my mistakes. And that would mean that I'm much more likely to keep trying. So that was a helpful story. Okay. Probably enough time on that. We'll move on. So the next strategy is based on this emotion side of the triangle. And this is all about setting what I call a positively phrased goal. So often when people come to me and they're procrastinating, often one of the key things they've done wrong is that they're setting what's called a negatively phrased goal. So all a negatively phrased goal is when you set a goal around what it is you want to stop or what it is you want to avoid. So for example, an example of a negatively phrased goal would be, I want to stop procrastinating, or I want to stop feeling bored or frustrated or anxious. So all a negatively phrased goal is phrase a goal around what it is we want to stop or avoid. What we really want to do with a negatively phrased goal, though, is we want to flip it. We want to create what's called a positively phrased goal. So a positively phrased goal, very, very simple. All it is when we phrase our goals around what it is that we want, what it is we want to achieve or develop or gain or learn. And there's very important reasons for this. So When we set our goals positively, what it does is it allows us to create a sense of progress. So when we figure out what it is that we want, we can start to break that down and start working our ways towards it. And that's super important in terms of our motivation because it creates positive emotion. In fact, the main source of positive emotion, as I was saying earlier, that you, me, or anyone else has, is when we make progress towards a goal that's important to us. Now, that goal can be in your relationships, that goal can be in your career, that goal can be in your business. Whatever it is, the main source of positive emotion that we have in our life is when we make progress towards a goal that's important to us. And that positive emotion is really important in terms of our motivation. So what tends to happen is this: a couple of particular areas of the brain tend to kick off when we set positively phrased goals. The first is the reward centers and dopamine. I mean, any kind of progress or any sense of achievement feels really, really good and really motivates. So this is how video games work. So, for example, Mario is, I don't know if you've ever played Mario, but most characters in video games, what happens is this: is you have an imaginary character. They're moving through an imaginary world, collecting imaginary coins or doing imaginary tasks, and it still feels good because it's tapping into our brain's reward centers through a sense of progress. The second thing that happens when we set positively phrased goal is another part of our brain called the reticular formation kicks in. So what happens is this: one part of our mind figures out where it is we want to go, another part of our mind figures out where we are, and the reticular formation starts to fill in the gaps. It literally starts to problem solve. And so it's a kind of the seat of creative thinking and problem solving. This is very, very important in terms of our productivity and getting things done. Conversely, when we set a negatively phrased goal, so when we set a goal around what it is we want to avoid or what it is we want to stop, this tends to create a lot of negative emotion. And this is because when we set a negatively phrased goal, they're usually, in fact, pretty much always unachievable. So for example, if you set yourself the goal, I want to stop procrastinating. The issue with that is you can never achieve it because you've always got the potential to procrastinate. This tends to create a lot of negative emotion. You can never win. You're always kind of faced with failure with it. And it also fails to take advantage of this sense of progress that we do when we have a positively phrased goal. So what happens here then is the threat systems in your brain and the amygdala tend to kick in, and this fear of failure. What happens often is we go into fight or flight. And this tends to change how we think. So when we go into fight or flight, we want to do one of two things. We want to kind of, I suppose, get aggressive and deal with the threat that way. We literally want to kill what's in front of us. Or flight is we want to run away from the threat. And the thing is with fight or flight, we don't really have to think a lot in order to do those things. So our focus tends to narrow. We tend to focus in on the problem. And the issue with that is we fail to kind of see possible solutions. Okay. So what I want you guys to do now is I want you to take whatever you're procrastinating about, and I want you to set a positively phrased goal if you haven't already done it. So I'll give you some examples of flipping a negatively phrased goal into a positively phrased goal. So one example of a negatively phrased goal that I had was I wanted to stop procrastinating about working on my thesis. So to flip that, you might say something like, I want to finish my master's thesis by September 31st. If you're procrastinating around a behavior or changing a habit, it might sound something like, you're saying, I want to stop procrastinating about beginning strength training. So what you want to do to flip that is say something like, I want to strength train for 4 days a week for 3 sets consistently for 1 month. It doesn't have to be that complicated. But you get the idea. We're taking I want to stop, and we're changing it into I want to, whatever it is we want to go to. Third example, a very common one I help people deal with is I want to stop procrastinating about answering emails. So a flip of that might sound something like, I want to clear my inbox, then create a system to empty my inbox at least once per week. So it's just phrasing it around what it is we want to do. Okay, so I want you to stick your positively phrased goal in the chat box. I just want to see if you got what I meant by that. And I can give you a hand if anyone has, if anyone is having issues with it. Ray, that's a very good point. September does only have 30 days. And very funnily, I did this talk about a week ago in person and someone pointed it out and I forgot to change the slide. I'll have to figure it out now, Ray. So stick your positively phrased goal in the chat box if you don't mind. Again, obviously, privacy is paramount here, but I just want to make sure you have this because it's very important for the last strategy that we're going to talk about. I will make those calls. Excellent, Gary. I want to create a social media strategy. Very good, Mary. Perfect. Celan is saying I can complete my research in time, ready for my business pitch. Awesome. Bernard, I want to complete my assignment in 2 weeks, 1 week ahead of the finish date. Excellent. Okay, cool. People seem to have got the idea. Cheers, Mary. Excellent. I will mend my shed roof by April 31st. Excellent, Ray. Fantastic. Okay, cool. Okay, so the last strategy we're going to talk about is all about breaking it down and using what's called the Pomodoro Method. So what's breaking it down about? Well, often the things we procrastinate about to us, they can seem very, very big. And the problem with a really big task or a really big project we're working on is it can be quite vague. The edges can be a bit blurry. We're not really sure what we should be doing in any given moment. And the issue with something that's big and vague is it creates a sense of the unknown in humans. And things that are big and vague and unknown tend to generate two emotions. The first is a little bit of dread or anxiety, because that big, scary, icky thing. Or the second is boredom, because when things are vague, when we're not sure what it is that we need to do, we can get quite bored. So what we want to do is we want to take that big, vague, icky, unknown goal, we want to break it down into smaller goals. And then we're going to break that down again and again to kind of get rid of that feeling of kind of being overwhelmed and that anxiety or boredom around it. We're going to break it down in a very specific way. So what I want you to do is I want you to take your end goal, your positively phrased end goal, so something like, I want to finish my master's thesis by September 30th. But you want to break it down first off into the key milestones. What are the major steps along the way, the important kind of signposts, So when I was working on my master's thesis, there was kind of three main sections to it. I had to finish a part called the introduction, I had to finish the statistical analysis, and I had to finish the discussion. The milestones are important because they can, one, I suppose you're taking that big thing and you're breaking it down into slightly more manageable chunks, but also we can kind of see if the strategies we're using are working. We can measure our progress a little bit when we have major milestones. So once you have your milestones, then what the next step you need to do is going to break your milestones into smaller goals. So for example, if I took my introduction and I wanted to break it down, simply enough, I just had to finish writing about topic A, finish writing about topic B, finish writing about topic C, and D, E, and F in the case of that. But we'll say A, B, and C for simplicity's sake. So again, you're breaking it down into something much more manageable and something you can put in front of you. When you have those smaller goals, then what I want you to do is I want you to break it down into what are called behavioral goals. So all a behavioral goal is, it's the actual action that you need to take in order to reach your smaller goals. So for example, for me to finish writing about topic A, I had to do two particular behaviors or two actions. One was I had to read about topic A, and two was I had to write about topic A. They're the only two behaviors I needed to do in order to reach that smaller goal of finishing topic A. Now, the nice thing about behavioral goals is we can make them time bound. What I mean by that, it means we can do the behavior for a particular amount of time. So for example, I could read about topic A for 25 minutes, or I could write about topic A for 25 minutes. And the nice thing about making a behavioral goal time bound, or creating what's called a time bound behavioral goal, is that you can create this sense of progress, this sense of achievement by doing the behavior for a particular amount of time. That means you don't have to worry about outcomes anymore, which is very, very important in terms of the next step we're talking about. So you create these time-bound behavioral goals, and what it means is, in order to get a sense of progress, you just have to do the behavior for a certain amount of time. So I suppose to explain how this works a little bit better, if you set yourself a goal that you're going to read for 25 minutes, and you sit down and you read for 25 minutes, you're going to feel a sense of achievement, a sense of progress, no matter how many words you've read. Similarly, if you set yourself a goal of, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write for 25 minutes, regardless of how many words you've written, you're still going to feel a sense of progress. You've actually sat down and done it. And that's very important for the last strategy we're going to do. It's called the Pomodoro Method. And this is just a series of time sprints you can use when you're working on a big project or working on something you need to get over the line. So the Pomodoro Method works like this. So you break down whatever that big task is into your smaller goals, and then you figure out what behaviors you need to do. So you break it down into behaviors. And then you commit to doing one of those behaviors for 25 minutes. So what you want to do, you want to take out your phone and get a timer, and you want to time it. It's very, very important. And after 25 minutes, once that timer goes off, you want to take a 5-minute break. Very important to time this as well, for obvious reasons. And after your 5-minute break, you're going to do it again. In fact, you're going to repeat it 6 times. And after you've done that 6 times, you are going to have lunch, because you've just done a very, very solid half day's work. So this works for a couple of reasons. The first is you're creating a trigger by setting the timer and fully committing to doing it. And so the thing is, no matter how horrible a task is, no matter how much we're avoiding, whatever it may be, is that we can do anything for probably about 25 minutes, no matter how horrible it is. The second thing is that 5-minute break gives you 3 different types of reward. So we got lots of that. So first off, you get a 5-minute break away from whatever the horrible thing is that you're working on, which is great in itself. A second type of reward is, though, you've got that sense of progress. And so you get a lot of positive emotion. You feel like you've achieved something. And the third type of reward is, because you're actually doing what it is that you're supposed to be doing now, regardless of outcome, you're spending time doing it, you can have this very powerful intrinsic motivation. You're doing what you should be doing. Now, the nice thing about this as well is you can vary the time spans. This is very important. If there's something you're really badly stuck on, what you can do is you can commit to doing it for 15 minutes. And I've never come across anyone yet anyway, that no matter how horrible the thing is that they were working on, that they couldn't commit to doing 15 minutes for me. You can go the other way. You can also bring it up to 50-minute sprints and then take a 10-minute break. But this is better sometimes when you get used to using the method, because it means you have less interruptions and you can kind of have a bit more flow. Final point about this is the breaks can be very useful in another way. So you can do menial tasks on them. So I'll often clean my apartment, or I'll do a little bit of prep for dinner, or I will do some laundry, or sometimes I'll even do like a little quick mini workouts during these little 5-minute breaks. And what that means is then at the end of your work day, not only have you got, a lot of work done, but also all those little jobs around the house are done as well. So it means your free time is your free time. And usually, after 5 minutes of doing a menial task, whether it's your laundry or cleaning or whatever, you're almost happy to go back to that thing that you were working on. Okay, so to finish up, what I want you guys to do is I want you to commit to your next step. I want you to commit to 25 minutes on whatever you've been procrastinating about. What I want you to do is I want you to commit to what behavior you're going to do, to get very, very specific about it. And I want you to get very specific about when you're going to do it. Yeah. So what are you going to do? When are you going to do it? Just for 25 minutes. And if you could stick it in the chat, I'd be very appreciative. But again, conscious of your privacy, etc. Let me know. What's your 25 minutes? What's when are you going to do it? What exactly? I'm conscious of time, guys, as well. I'm very sorry. I'll be 2 or 3 minutes and we'll finish up. But let me know in the chat box what your 25 minutes are going to be, or when you're going to do it. Create initial columns for the Excel sheet the first thing tomorrow morning. Excellent, Donald. Very good. Cool. Nice. And again, you do 25-minute sprints at that, you'd be amazed what you can get done. I'm going to put 25 minutes aside on Friday to review all of the CVs received in the week for our advertised job. Excellent. Gillian, what I would say with that is that's great. Pick an actual time. Set a reminder on your phone. Because what can happen is kind of things that are urgent and important, mini emergencies, whatever, can get in the way. If you schedule time for stuff like that, it can really help. Who else is there now? Going to start tonight clearing paperwork. Excellent, Mary. Nice. Research for 25 minutes in the morning for 3 days, analyze data and draft pitch. Excellent. Get Garrett about it. Excellent, Aoife. Really nice and specific. Sit down and do it. From tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., starting taking calls off my lists. Excellent, Gary. Look in the living room, look for bank statement tomorrow at 9 a.m. Excellent. And decide on question A or B in assignment, select referencing material. Excellent. Cool. I'll talk to you a little bit about the decision process if you want in a little bit, Bernard. Can be some interesting stuff on that too. Okay, so to finish up, I'm very sorry, I'm going slightly over time. Today we talked about the what and the how and the why of procrastination, and that these particular behaviors are often very much associated with particular emotions and particular stories that we tend to tell ourselves that would lead to us avoiding doing what we should be doing. So hopefully around that one thing we're working on, I helped you identify your story and maybe to challenge and rewrite that story using some of those Socratic questions. We also spoke about the importance of a positively phrased goal and how important that is in terms of our motivation. So focus on what it is you want, what it is you're trying to avoid. And as you progress towards that, it tends to feel pretty bloody good. Finally, we kind of, I suppose this is the quick hack in terms of that, when you really need to get moving on something, breaking the thing down into the actual behaviors and using the Pomodoro method. So you're focused on just doing the behavior for a specific amount of time rather than worrying about how much you're going to get to do it. The nice thing about that is once you get started, once you get moving, watch, you will be flying, but also very important to take the breaks because you want to teach yourself to reward yourself. Okay, so I'll finish up with that. You take out your phone and you scan that QR code on the screen, it'll open up my linked tree. So a couple of things. If you're interested in, I suppose, exploring some of the topics I talked about earlier, like confidence and stress, well-being and happiness for yourself or your team, reach out, book a one-to-one consultation. I'd love to have a chat with you about it. The second thing is, if you enjoyed today and I found today useful, what would be very, very helpful to me is to leave a Google review. There's a link in that linked tree thing. It'll just take 2 or 3 seconds. I'd find that very, very useful. My marketing people are always giving out to me for not asking for this. And the final thing, if you enjoyed today, there's a link there to join my meetup, Practical Psychology, or join my mailing list, but the meetup might be an interesting one. So I do talks myself, but I also bring in other psychologists and speakers as well, and we do lots of free talks and workshops. The next one is going to be on self-sabotage, and that's on in about 3 weeks. That should be posted up later tonight, actually. And other than that, I want to say thank you very, very much. I hope you guys enjoy it. I hope you guys find it somewhat useful. Some really nice comments coming in on the chat, which is great. I suppose, I'm back doing in-person events as well, which is nice in terms of an interaction. These are great because we can reach a lot of people, but it is nice to hear stuff in the chat because I am talking to a screen. So awesome. Thank you so much for that.